Thank you very much to San Francisco Python Meetup organizers, especially Grace Law, for inviting me. When she first invited me, I gave her a bunch of topics which have been banging around in my head. Apparently this one was picked. Apparently there was some sort of voting. So what that means is that if you don't like my talk, it's not my fault. Blame the democratic process. And I also was going to make some sort of joke about how in page 17 of the NDA, which you had to sign, there was something which said you couldn't say anything bad about my talk publicly. But since we're at Yelp, I don't have to do that. They're already censoring me. Okay, I'm back on. Okay. Thank you. Good? Yes, okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about antipatterns in large Python code bases. But before I dig into the actual meat, I get to spend a few minutes bloviating about myself, as is traditional. Okay. So as those of you who can read English or understand spoken English know, my name is Benjamin Peterson. I've been hanging around the Python community for about 6 years now. I work on CPython, where most significantly I'm the 2.7 release manager, which mostly these days means telling people that no, you can't have that fancy feature in Python 2.7. I've also worked on PyPy, py.test. I wrote the fancy assertion introspection features in py.test, which everybody hates me once it breaks because you're doing weird stuff with import. I'm doing weirder stuff with import. Okay, technical difficulties resolved. Sweet, thanks. Okay, yeah, so Python. Most recently in SF Python, I was on that Python 3 panel a few weeks ago. I was representing both the doom and gloom and totally unanchored to any reality or fact camps. Namely, I predicted the inevitable demise of Python and its supplantation with the rising superpower Perl 6. Yeah, so that's enough Python 3 trolling. Wow, I really wish Google Docs supported SVGs. It wouldn't look so pixelated. Okay. Yeah, so people who are generous enough to pay the bills and put up with me is Dropbox. I work on infrastructure, most specifically at the moment, videos. I'm not going to talk about videos at all, but if you'd like to work on videos, come talk to me. In fact, what I'm actually going to talk about is having a lot of Python code and being unhappy about it. So antipatterns in large Python code bases. It's kind of something where you just pick a couple things and then you talk about them. I think that if you took every pattern in the world and you put it into some sort of probability space and then you picked it random, you would get an anti-pattern with probability 100%. So yeah, and I mean it's a lot easier to talk about anti-patterns than actual good patterns because you have to argue that they're good. It's easier to argue that things are bad. Yeah, so one thing you're going to find about this talk is that I'm lazy. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about I've worked on a lot of large Python code bases, and I'd like to cherry pick a few of the things I found. It's going to go in sort of a small to large order. I'm going to talk about things that you might find on one line of Python, and then eventually I'm going to get into a philosophical bullshit. Okay, so the number one thing which you might see in a large Python code base is that it's been worked on by people who were hired at 3 a.m. in the morning and started working at 4:30. And they had been up the previous 36 hours. And so they were pretty smart people, so they managed to get stuff done. But the way that they got the stuff done is pretty horrific after the hangover passed. So, for example, this is a way to check whether a key is in a dictionary. Yes, I'm sorry to say I actually saw this. Yeah. Yeah. And so it's really lovely. Like it probably like traverses every key in the dictionary about 3 times, which completely defeats the point of having a dictionary. But it is like kind of impressive that they know about count. It's kind of an obscure method on list. I mean, how many of you knew about count on list? I think it was added in 2.6. Yeah. Okay. And then this is a slightly different thing, but some people don't know about from imports. So you end up with stuff like this where people want to reference something as a module without saying the whole package, so they just use an as import, repeating the module name to get the module. And so the best thing about this is that, like, I think most people know that you can use from imports to get modules, but people just copy this stuff around. And so, like, 3 years later, after like this seed of evil, you'll have 100 imports, and all of them will be doing this because it seemed like a good idea when it was first written. Now, another problem which you might encounter is people who are being way too clever with Python and are putting way too much onto one line, namely this thing. This is all one line. So I particularly like the use of the star args here. You see you have a list. Oh, I mean, like 4 parentheses. It's like some sort of emoticon hell. There's something about, so this is like using SQL alchemy. There's something about this generative pattern which just lets you chain calls after calls, which makes people, which like removes inhibitions or something. It's like a terrible drug. And then they put all this stuff on one line just because they can. So like the simple fix to this would be to just put it on 25 lines. But I have to wonder about this generative pattern. And sometimes, especially with the SQL stuff, it would be probably clearer if you actually had the SQL statement which is being generated in here. The problem is you can't do that because of escaping. So I don't know what the good solution is to this yet. Okay. So my talk and Alex's share something in common. We're both going to talk about models gone wrong. In fact, I'm going to talk about abstraction inversion a bit. Okay, so let's say you're in your new startup, you're writing your website, you're really sure that your social network for deceased statisticians is going to get hundreds of millions of users within the first few weeks. So you want to write some scalable code. And if you're a person in this room, you would probably start writing something like this. You would have a user class, and then you would, wow, this is a laser pointer. That'd be cool. Sweet. Okay. And then, so here's the database access. We're just going to treat this as a black box, and it fetches a SQL proxy row. Okay, you get a row back, and then you have this user class, which is going to be in charge of wrapping the database row, and it's just going to sort of know how to handle that, and everything else is not going to know how to handle the database. It's never going to see the row. It's just going to access it through things like properties and methods. So say we had a potential username method here, which just takes the first part of the email address as the username. Okay, so that's all very nice. If you really hated your future self, you might do something like this. So what do we have here? Here we have still have a user class, and we still have our fetch by ID method here, which is going to return the database row. But we already see that the database row is going to escape the model here. Whoever calls this is going to get the raw row back. And so that's usually a controller. So you're going to be passing the row around, and then you have this static method which knows how to deal with the user row, which does what the username property did in the last slide. So it accesses that. Here, can you guys see back there if I go on that slide, or should I do this one? Okay, no answer. Okay. Maybe I'll switch. So as I say, so yeah, you have this, and the really scary thing about this is that all your controller code now has access to the raw row, and invariably it will start using it. And so let's look at how this might look in 2 years. So you'll have what passes for a class, but is actually just a sad module. And it just has 400 static methods which know how to do stuff with user rows. And your controllers are using the user row all over the place. And since you have to do some processing on the user rows before you can actually do anything with the controller, they're like poking around in it, and they're all doing it in consistent ways. So please wrap your database stuff, as Alex said. Okay, now we get to talk a bit about code organization, or at least one rather horrific thing I've seen. And I'm going to tell a story. So one time I was at the office, and instead of doing what I usually do, which is carry on long philosophical conversations about Renaissance humanist poetry using the Yo app, I decided to do real work. So I fired on my editor. I use Emacs, so I still managed to get a few Yos in before it started up. And I was editing a bunch of files. And then at some point, I realized that I had all these files open in my editor. And you may see something in common about this. Namely, there's a lot which are named util.py or have util at the end, as if that's better. Okay, so I thought, well, that's interesting. I was like, you know, I'm sick of doing work. I could investigate this intriguing mystery. So I wrote this cryptic Unix command. So those of you who haven't wasted your brain space on this sort of crud, this Unix command finds all the files which end with util or utils.py, and then counts them. It's actually kind of amusing that the best code in this entire presentation is a bunch of shell. And so, like, I get this number back, 178 files are like utils, and I think, okay, so that means like 20% of our code base is a useless util thing. And I go around digging in this. I find things like this. So, I mean, this is like geo-util.py. I look in the same directory, and is there a file called geo.py? No, there isn't. So, I mean, yeah, it's like functions which have to do with geolocation, and for some reason, somebody thought it would be a good idea to put util on it. But the one which really took the cake for me was this one. I mean, God, consider this. This is a work of art. It's not server util/util.py. No, that would be too pedestrian. Util/utils.py. Somebody like actually consciously thought about this. They knew they were crafting work for future programmers to enjoy. And then you go and you look in this file and you find like stuff which should be in a museum. You know, there's a 25-line regular expression which apparently is for validating email addresses. And you notice that it like doesn't actually work on non-ASCII email addresses. You find this this utility which calls your parents every week and tells them you're doing fine, you have a great dating life, and the rumor that You spend all your time in front of a computer crying, wondering why your website doesn't handle non-ASCII emails. Is just that a scurrilous rumor spread by your enemies? Yeah, okay. So please, people, be bold. Don't put it in a file called util.py. People will thank you after. It's just like random stuff which people were too scared to put somewhere else. Okay, next thing. Yes, testing. Okay, so I am not going to harp on the fact that testing is important and that you should do it, because I'm sure, much like me, you were all raised well, and at the age of 12, your parents took you aside and told you to always write tests for your code. So I'm not going to tell you that's important, because you already know that. What I do want to talk about is a particular thing which affects large code bases in testing, and especially large applications. So when you have a large website, and by that I mean more than one server, you often have to have servers talk to each other, and you have different programs like communicating with each other and to get things done. And so I've seen this problem a lot where we'll have each component will be individually tested, and you'll mock out the calls to another server so you can more easily unit test it. You'll be like, oh, great, I fixed the bug. Everything works great. And then you'll push it to production. And then you'll find out the servers can't, in fact, communicate because you never tested them communicating. You just tested that they sort of do their individual thing. And so that is why I'm a big fan of integration tests. When you think about it, it's like being a matchmaker for two friends who have totally irreconcilable religious beliefs. I mean, it's like, hello, authentication server. I know this web server who you should really meet. And no, the fact that you have completely incompatible views of RPC formats doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So I do not believe two servers can talk to each other unless I see them talking to each other in front of my very eyes. And neither should you. Okay, so please. Are the feds here? Okay. Yeah, and so, but people like to complain, oh, but the integration tests are so slow. And I say, well, yes, because people get very gung-ho, and they realize each test case takes 6 hours because for some reason the setup fixture thinks that it needs to move the space shuttle from Cape Canaveral to the launch pad, and then tear down, launches it and brings it back to Earth sort of safely. And so that's true. They can be slow, but they're definitely worth it. And you can mitigate this by only starting up your servers once in your test session. And I think another pragmatic thing to do is have a couple integration tests for the basic failure and success cases, so you know that they can do some sort of communication, and then unit test the edge cases with mocks. What are we next? Yes, we're into the philosophical bullshit. Okay. Yes, so what I'm going to say is that humans are lazy. And for example, that should be pointing the other way. I apologize to the people on that side of the room. I didn't. For example, I'm lazy. For example, I just called out humans lazy without really qualifying what I meant. But what I mean by that is that people will not write code better than the code they're currently editing unless they consciously think about it. So I wonder if you know what cargo culting is. So cargo culting is a fun phrase which means you take something, in this case, a piece of code from somewhere else or an idea, and you just use it because you don't really understand how it works, but it seems to work over there, so you use it. Like a classic one for this is that people just copy around hash table load factor constants. And if you look back through like all 50 years of software, which have been just copying that constant around, you realize it's from the art of programming, which is okay. So that one was okay to cargo cult probably. But I mean, a not uncommon occurrence for me is to be doing some code review where I notice that the code is doing something bad. Let's just say, for example, it's using MongoDB. And so I say to the author of the code, why are you doing this bad thing? And the author of code says, well, I mean, our payments processing code is doing that all over the place. And I say, well, if our payments processing code ran off a cliff, would you follow it? And they say, well, not exactly. I would get paged at 3 in the morning with a message that says, payments code has run off a cliff. And then I would have to go follow it and perform some sort of heroic rescue involving CPR, helicopters, and duct tape, along with a liberal smattering of 4-letter words. And so usually I convince them to not use MongoDB. No company I've ever worked for has actually used MongoDB for payments processing, so rest assured, rest assured. So this sort of cargo culting thing is why I think bad code shares certain properties with a biological organism called necrotizing fasciitis. Or in common parlance, flesh-eating bacteria, in that it will slowly poison the rest of your code as people write code which is not actively better than the bad code. And so, like, the only way you can treat flesh-eating bacteria is amputating whatever limb it's in. And so that is also what you need to do with bad code. And hence, I have this like inelegant but kind of cool maxim. Yes, okay. Okay, I invented this. Yes, so the basic idea is every time you are about to edit a piece of code, you should find out whether you can delete it. This, like, you wouldn't think this would matter so much, but this has saved me years of work. Where you're like, oh God, I have to go fix the payment processing code now. And it's like, I mean, usually you can't delete that, but maybe like you can delete the Bitcoin processing part or something. I guess that didn't make anybody money. Okay, so yes, and now we get to the point of the talk where you can ask me questions, and I will mumble incoherently for 4 minutes in response. Alternatively, you can just flat out tell me I'm wrong, and I'll heartily agree with you. What else can you do? Yes, so if you want to email me, you can use any email address which matches this regular expression.
Sure.
Usually, like, if you want to, do Dropbox stuff, you email the Dropbox one, and other things go to the Python one, but they both go to the same person. I'm almost there.
So
one second. And if you have really negative feedback, what I suggest doing is posting on your personal blog and submitting it to Hacker News. Okay, now, yes, questions.